עכשיו נעבור לסוגיה האיראנית.
I will move on to the Iranian issue, which is the main security issue that we're facing. We are delighted to invite to the stage some of the best experts to discuss this core issue and to also address the question, are we running out of time?
To invite Richard Goldberg to the stage. Richard Goldberg is former director of countering Iranian weapons of mass destruction at the White House. אני מתכבדת להזמין
I'm honored to invite Major General Amikam Nolkin, former commander of the Israeli Air Force. I'm also honored to invite Dr. Eyal Hulata, former head of the National Security and former National Security Advisor at the Prime Minister's office. The session will be moderated by Dr. Ronen Bergman, and I see that his arm is in a cast, so we wish him the best of health. He's a journalist and commentator on national security affairs on the Yediot Ahronot newspaper as well as the New York Times. But just before we begin, a 30-second segue, and then we can begin. Hello everyone, good morning. As we were coming up, and we were introduced, and they said about the Iranian nuclear threat, or the nuclear threat that is the most important threat, or the greatest challenge that the state of Israel and the Middle East are perhaps dealing with. I remembered one night, I think it was back in 2003 or 2004, when the editor at the desk at Yediot Ahronot called me up, and she said, "That's it, you're left without any work, you've run out of topic to cover." What happened, I asked. They've decided, the Iranians have agreed to dismantle their nuclear project. And I said, I trust them that they'll make sure that we still have enough work. 20 years have passed and nothing has changed. Every once in a while they'll tell us that they tell us that the challenge is over, that they're getting rid of their nuclear project, but of course it doesn't happen. Or maybe they declare that their nuclear endeavor is intended for peace purposes. But I think that the challenge is merely ever increasing. And I think that if anyone were to ask today, who started and what started and who's winning? Who's winning in this shadow war between Israel and Iran that is now being waged in every corridor, in every street in the Middle East? It would be difficult to say. Often people would ask me before February of last year, when will the war between Iran and Israel begin? And I said, well, I think it started a long time ago, but I said wars in the 21st century are not, waged between columns of tanks, raging or driving through Europe. Little did I know that they did, but wars in the Middle East are run differently. And I'd like to thank Amos for inviting me, who has honored me and invited me to moderate the panel. And I think I'll stop talking now and give the floor to our guests. I'd like to start with an easy question from Major General Amikam Nolkin to get things started. Is the Air Force ready to attack and destroy the Iranian nuclear project? Good morning, everyone. When we prepared for this panel, Ronen said to me that he's going to ask this question, and this is why he came with his arm in a sling. And that's why he came with his arm in a sling, but he decided to ask it anyhow. So let me tell you, 2 weeks ago, there was this campaign in Gaza. And this campaign, this operation ended more or less after 3 minutes. With what happened there is that 3 commanders found their death in a matter of 3 seconds in 3 different locations in the city, following an air operation. I don't think that there are many air forces in the world that, thanks to top quality intel and excellent synchronization of the entire military, would manage to accomplish that. This is not something that you prepare or build for in one day of preparations, not even 1 week. Even if it's in Gaza, it takes months of preparations. And now I'm moving on to your question, and it's important for me to say that when this question is asked, are we prepared, are we ready, it's not a snapshot, it's a video. And on that video, there are a lot of elements, a lot of components that it takes years to prepare them. Some of them come from the field of intel, others in force design or force buildup. Some come from the field of operational preparedness. And, you know, as time passes, or the more time that passes, then one can say that Israeli preparedness is constantly improving. But some people might say, and I think that these are voices that were also expressed in the previous government, that after the signing of the JCPOA, the Air Force, of course, it's the main element, the entire IDF, but mainly the Air Force lowered their preparedness for an effective attack of the Iranian nuclear project in favor for a better preparedness for Gaza. We've just seen that performance you've just mentioned, and everything that happened with Hezbollah, the exposure of the tunnels and the ability to wage the next war with them. 5 years have passed, and you didn't prepare, and that was also on your shift. I think that signing the JCPOA is a strategic event that occurred, and its interpretation, the way it was expressed in the IDF, was a change in priorities and a switch to a long-term planning in favor of short-term plans, and therefore, at the time in the IDF, under the instruction of the Chief of General Staff, priorities did change, and indeed this, of course, was approved by the government, and the preparedness had switched from a month-by-month level of preparedness to one that spans a decade. I think that, you know, leaving the JCPOA, that's yet another change, and following that, the Chief of General Staff had once again decided to change the priorities and to once again place the Iranian issue at the top of the agenda, and this was immediately manifest in the work plans of the military. And yet, if we'll try to quantify it in time, in the perspective of time, for example, receiving the new refueling aircrafts from the U.S., I think it will happen next year, and other indicators, when will the Air Force be prepared for an effective attack of the Iranian nuclear capabilities, an attack that will result in enough damage? I think that regardless of your position and place in time, it would be irresponsible to state a date. But what I can say is that preparedness is constantly improving. And I'm not just saying this in order to avoid answering your question, but I'm just trying to demonstrate what's truly happening in our security processes. The intel is constantly being gathered. Obviously, the offensive capabilities are constantly improving, the assault attack capabilities, and of course the fact that we're procuring refueling aircrafts, combat jets, and helicopters, all that has added also to the preparedness. And as time goes by, our preparedness improves, and once the decision is reached, then the military will be able of coming up with a plan. Switching to English.
The calculation at the White House when President Trump withdrew from the JCPOA May 8, 2018, was that Iran is going to be either surrendering to some of the so-called Pompeo points, or threatening war and then facing the almighty firepower of the United States of America. But Iran, surprised, did neither and effectively withdrew from the JCPOA. So in hindsight, and you know, we are journalists, we are very brave to look at hindsight, but in hindsight, don't you think it was a miscalculation to make that decision, to withdraw the US from the JCPOA?
In short, no. I think when you go back in time and you think about the decisions in front of the administration at the time of 2018, the fundamental fatal flaws of the JCPOA, the timeline that the Iranians would have in front of them if you gave the agreement 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, reaching all the different sunsets while the Iranian economy grew, while foreign direct investment grew, while their presence in the region became deeper and more advanced, while their ballistic missile and cruise missile programs advanced, and their nuclear R&D continued, you would have what we face today on steroids. And so while we think of this as a moment of crisis that could have been averted, we should be thinking about the crisis that could have been had we continued.
What do you mean on steroids? They would be still, at least until that time, or until the end of the waiver of on the oil sanctions in 2019, the Iranians were more or less following the JCPOA. They were not enriching more to a higher percent or to a larger quantity.
They were following the JCPOA largely because the JCPOA gave them the sort of treasure map to a nuclear weapon over 10 to 15 years. So long as they just kept following the map, they get everything they wanted and then some. The calculation was when, I think in a moment of clarity, Secretary Pompeo, confronted with this question at one point, said, we can have this confrontation with a weaker Iran without long-range ballistic missiles capable of hitting the United States, or we can have this confrontation later when Iran is that much stronger economically, regionally, and militarily. And we chose the confrontation early on. The idea of the maximum pressure campaign, the idea that we would have all tools of government being used to exert pressure on the regime, was correct and still is correct in many ways. Political warfare, economic warfare, military deterrence, covert action, whole range of gray zone warfare opportunities, working in partnership with Israel, with our Gulf allies, encircling the regime. Somewhere between a containment strategy and a victory strategy like Ronald Reagan in the Cold War. That all makes sense if you actually have the military deterrence. And that was the piece that I think the former president was missing until, let's say, 2020, when a young man named Qasem decided to depart the earth. At that point, there was a little bit coming back, and you started hearing rumors that the president was considering military options on the nuclear program as well, and you did see a change in behavior by the regime. The escalation moves that the Iranians were starting with in 2019 when we finally took away the waivers for the oil sanctions and started to try to drive their revenue towards zero. And we saw the instability growing. Remember the protests in 2019, sort of a first run of what we've seen in the last 7, 8 months. That moment was when they started their low-level enrichment. They started breaking through the JCPOA caps, first at the LEU levels. Then they started reopening Fordo in November 2019. They never went to that 20% HEU, high-enriched uranium threshold. They never went forward to a more threatening posture until it was clear that the Trump administration was out and the Biden administration was coming in. Had we continued, this is all sort of these counter narratives, had you continued maximum pressure, had you had military deterrence in place, had you enforced all sanctions from 2020 into 2021 into 2022, can you predict where we would be at? No, you cannot. It's all a counter narrative. But, yeah, go ahead.
As much as you cannot predict what would happen if Trump would not withdraw from the JCPOA, Eyal Khulata, אתה נכנס לתפקיד...
Eyal Khulata, you began your position in the previous administration. After the Qasem Soleimani event happened already, Fakhri Tzadid, head of the military nuclear program, dies. They will think that Israel is responsible for his heart attack, and they're responsible for activities in Lebanon and Syria. A lot of sabotage. As you, as the consultant for national security, this is heaven, right? This is for you to say no, of course not. Heaven, okay. Iran, let's begin with Iran. Is certainly a country that should get that title. It's a beautiful country with a lot of cultural, cultural heritage, culinary heritage, enormously impressive in that sense. So if I sort of, look at your question from a different angle, the thing that we need to be dealing with, and we were in the previous government, we certainly were, was to sort of untie the knots that, were described by the speakers before me. Reality in the summer of 21, when the government started, I just started my position several months following. The Americans already were deep in their attempts to go back to the JCPOA, which was Israel, something that Israel, of course, objected to at the time. I think we were beginning, and we accelerated as well, that it was described as acceleration to readiness, to the point where we would have no choice. Yet, with an IDF that's not ready. Because if tomorrow you want to give an instruction to attack, you can't. I think that Norkin was very precise, that readiness, preparedness is not a threshold, that then from that on, when you say we are, ready for anything, or optimally ready. And in the same time, I would say that the IDF knew that its level of preparedness in the summer of 21 was not sufficient for the demands of the day, and so there was a great acceleration of efforts. 2 years later now, I think the system is much better prepared. And I think that we should continue, of course, and hope that this continues so that we be better prepared even more in the future. Now, at the point where, God forbid, it shouldn't be an aspiration. It should be something we hope to avoid. But let's say, God forbid, we reach a point where the other elements have failed to be realized, that Iran is now fully realizing its nuclear potential. 90%, Rich said that earlier, enriched. That's certainly the right direction for them, but it's not a full bomb. Somewhere within that margin, Israel may find itself in a situation where it doesn't have any other way, any other recourse besides military to deal with nuclear Iran. That's where we're preparing for, and it's not a policy really that has changed according to, this kind of politics or that kind of politics, right or left. There were governments who did this better and implemented it better or worse, but I think that we do work hand in hand with the IDF in order to do everything that needs to be done for preparedness. But the policy is pretty much the same. But I think your previous boss, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, said, no, it does change the policy. What he talked about, the octopus doctrine, that you shouldn't only address nuclear targets within Iran, the centrifuge, so forth, but if Iran uses drones from anywhere, then attack their drone sites. So I think here there's a real argument between the Mossad that you worked in and between the IDF. These two differing views that say we have to leave things low profile, because we have to be allowed to continue to work in Syria and not come to an overall encounter with Iran. And there are those in the IDF that would say, oh, everything that we warned about is happening in Iran, and now Iran is working against us within Israel. Look what happened in the last period of time. That's under your watch. I don't think your description, with all due respect, I don't think it's precise about the tensions between the two institutions or factors. I think, yes, in order to implement the policy that I described, it is important to leave our front versus Iran under a certain level, so that if we have to act, we can act, and that the Air Force, should it be needed, is ready, and strategically we are set. Until that point, and for 20 years now, Israel has been managing a campaign, a broad and very varied campaign, by the way, some of which is IDF in Syria, some of it is other measures in Iran, where its level of complexity relies on the field in which we are, on the context in which we're functioning and operating. in order to give the time necessary not to allow Iran to move forward in their nuclear and their long-range missiles and their attack capabilities against us. You're right that in the time of the Bennett government, Bennett did lead, I'd say, an approach that was maybe more determined, more resolute against Iran, and I think that actually it proved its benefits and it stopped Iran or postponed Iran. Other stories, maybe other administrations may be slightly different, but Iran has tried in several times, in fact, to send drones and unmanned vehicles and more sophisticated things against Israel, and at some point it stopped. And what happened 1 second later? And it says in the New York Times wrote about it, yeah. So, look, I think this expresses the way that this thing operates. Nolken and I both served for many years in the, dealing with Iran. I don't think that there were great controversies, certainly not problems of principle on this matter. IDF used its tools, the Mossad used its tools, and I think together we created pretty coherent policy against Iran for a long time. And when you have to do all your calculations before attack, I mean, then there's the attack, the damage, and then the day next, meaning the war with the Hezbollah. Now, I was told by Ehud Barak, that was, defense minister in 2002, he said, why did the IDF go against the plans for attack? Why? Because the IDF saw what happened to the senior officers in 2006 in the Second Lebanon War, and they don't want that to happen the next day following the war with Hezbollah. So when the commander of the Air Force or anybody has to make these calculations, how can they encapsulate the day next after the beginning of the attack? I think definitively that the Chief of General Staff, the head of Operations Directorate, the head of the Commander of the Air Force, that assuming that we do begin such a mission, that we have to be prepared for a regional war. If you don't require of yourself to be prepared, then you're not doing your job right. So when we plan such an activity, and by the way, just a month ago, there was another article that was about the attack on the power plant in Syria, in which the speakers described that along with the planning of the central mission, we were also very involved, and I can say it in my head, I was head of operations in the Air Force. I was very much preparing the Air Force for a war that may occur following that attack. Hopefully it would not occur, but if it should occur, we need to be ready. So back to your question. I think it's the responsibility of senior commanders to to prepare their organizations within the military for exactly that kind of scenario.
What were the demands, what should be the demands of the U.S. from Israel on covert operation? This is maybe the most sensitive part of those intimate, extensive relationship. Should Israel ask permission? Should Israel say in advance, this is what we are going to do? Or maybe to leave plausible denial for America and say nothing and just wink and nod, as Israelis usually do afterwards. Say, we only heard it on television.
Obviously, it's a choice and the prerogative of the Israeli government. There are times historically when the Israeli government has brought key issues to American interlocutors at a very high level before taking action, either to deconflict, either to...
So not to be specific, but
maybe
for
you've
example,
written about these issues before in a book I've read.
But did Israel ask President Trump in meetings that you were present to assassinate Professor Fakhrizadeh?
Another young man who left the earth. Interesting question. I recently interviewed Prime Minister Netanyahu right before he came into government for a podcast, the Jewish Insider podcast, and I asked him a very tough question, and he paused, and he said, "It's a good question. I'm going to answer the question that you should have asked." So I do think that maybe we saw a little bit, Fakhrizadeh, other operations, as those to me seem like just very ambitious versions of what we had seen in the past of Israeli doctrine. And obviously we have a very close intelligence relationship. It ebbs and flows perhaps a little bit during administrations, but I would say that post-Obama administration, from Trump administration forward, there really has been an incredible partnership at various levels. I would say closer than ever before in history, including on the intelligence files on Iran. And that's good for both countries. What I do see happening during the Octopus Doctrine transition is a reframing of all of this conversation, right? I think in an American audience, perhaps in an Israeli audience, we are all still talking to the Air Force commander about preparations for something like 1981 or 2007, only on a grander scale. And we are not living in 2023, in the age of gray zone warfare, of hybrid warfare, of a range of spectrum of military options, covert in nature, some not covert, the new relationships emerging in the region that can have an impact, countries bordering Iran, countries on the periphery of Iran. And so when we say, you know, is the IDF ready, right? I don't actually know what that means anymore, because there's gonna have to be a range of options in place, both for the timing of action that will be necessary. If the decision to act is tomorrow, or by the end of the year, or early next year, or if it's in 2 years, it can't be dependent on when a new KC is being delivered. If Israeli action against Iran is dependent on that, you guys have already telegraphed way too much to the Iranians. And so I really credit the Octopus Doctrine and the continuation of that, because it does change the game for the Iranians in a very material way. And we see, you know, we talk about all the problems and the crisis. There are opportunities. The fact that the Iranians are in the streets, the fact that you saw what you saw late last year, even after a year and a half, 2 years of the Biden administration not enforcing sanctions, yes, they're still on the books, they didn't enforce them, offering to go back to the nuclear deal. Still, those sanctions in place, not even being enforced, are still biting the Iranian economy. They're running out of funds. The instability inside the regime is obvious to us. And so there are options on the table for the United States to act right now that have not been pulled. There are light switches that need to go on in Washington as they evaluate their plan B. But the Israelis now have plan B, plan C, plan D, and Washington, as far as I can tell, are not actively supporting those options, but are not standing in the way of those options.
General Nokene, when you look at the war in Ukraine, and you want to, you know, extrapolate, learn from what we see there in Ukraine, on what Mr. Goldberg says, this calls it a hybrid, you know, front. It's not 1981. It's not any other year. What do you see in the Ukraine now, 2023, that can help us understand what we're facing? There's more than one thing. There's also a group analyzing this and providing recommendations to the military. But I think that what we see in Ukraine, what we talked about in Israel for many years, and it was hard for us to convince our partners, and I think now in this hall, right now, we can say people, finally, the penny dropped, people got it. Why the suicide drones, the unmanned aerial vehicles of all kinds, the infiltration, the threats that we've been talking about for years, along, of course, with the missiles and of course, ground operations. I think that in our region, in the Middle East, particularly Hezbollah in Iran, particularly a little bit in Gaza, we see this on a smaller scale, that the drones that are relatively advanced on the one hand, these drones, they're not particularly expensive, they're quite accurate. They are adding another layer to the threat. Israel is a country with no strategic geographic depth. The only strategic depth that we have is provided by intel, and with our ties with our partners around the world, of course, first among those the US, and the relationships that we have in the Middle East with the countries surrounding us, some of them. And this process that was discussed quite a bit also by the American government and the Israeli government of building a regional defense alliance, it's very complicated. It's been going on for years. But I think what we see in Ukraine very much accelerated. So your Aluf Barim, the man who replaced you in your position, if you had to go to Oman and go to the UAE now and say, look, this is the threat, let's connect our radars, let's work together, our alert systems, because that's the only way we'll get a force multiplier to work together. Now it's easier, right? Yes, it's easier today. Also, the Saudis are dealing with such a threat, have been for several years. And the other Gulf states, our friends in the Emirates, have already dealt with such a threat. So we do have a common language to speak. And with, of course, the American command, and I think that the relationship is now the best it's ever been with the Americans, by the way, operationally, in terms of Air Force intel. I think that this is undoubtedly an opportunity to build capabilities and a network that will allow us to create strategic depth for the State of Israel and deal with a whole range of threats. And we can see this specific threat now as in the war in Ukraine. Now, the previous prime minister is now the current prime minister, but when Bennett was the prime minister, he laughed at him and joked at him, and he said, what's the most important role of a prime minister? To pick up the phone and speak to the American president, and he'll answer you. And he said, and he was talking to somebody else in the room, picking up the phone and having the U.S. president answer you is the biggest power you can have. And he said, Bennett doesn't have that power. I don't know what we would say about Netanyahu today about that, in that respect, if that was the benchmark. But let's say you're responsible for the strategic ties with the U.S. The Americans are very unsatisfied with any clandestine maritime events. They have negotiations that are, they're handling negotiations that some people in Israel support, but the Israeli government opposes. And at some point, the President of the United States, when he met Bennett, Prime Minister Bennett, he said, tell us about all of your clandestine operations. That doesn't sound like a great relationship. First of all, Prime Minister Bennett really had the ability to pick up the phone and speak to the President of the U.S. And beyond that, the visit to the White House at the end of August, which then turned into the early of September because there was the Kabul blast. You remember that explosion, and that delayed them for 24 hours. But in any case, it was a great visit. I think I was in most of the meeting. I don't remember any demand from the President of the United States, any demand, tell me about every mission and operation, but there was an entire discussion. But you were in most of the meeting when they talked about nuclear weapons in Israel, that you weren't in that meeting? No? There are certain things that, in facing the cameras, I'm not going to describe, but I can certainly say Prime Minister Bennett at the time said to the President of the United States in that meeting that Israeli policy towards Iran will rely, of course, on Israeli national security needs. And I think what Bennett said later in the press conference on the matter was he talked about broad strokes, meaning Israel has great interest in, of course, coordinating in principle with the Americans, but that doesn't mean that Israel has to get approval from the United States for every operation. Now, by the way, this was clear on the Israeli side, but it was also clear on the American side. And then Lapid was prime minister, and the treaty and the agreement on Jerusalem, Biden and Lapid, it says Israel has a right to defend itself by itself. Everybody in the room understands what that means, certainly in regards to that particular visit. And it was written, and the Americans, of course, collaborated on that and signed off on it. Not only that, the process then later, and we talked about this in the White House in the summer, but when Juniper Oak occurs, right? That was in your... Juniper Oak, that was, you were still in your position, or, okay, it was just when you were... Okay, it's part of that as well. That's part of the same thinking, that Israel, that we don't commit to, informing the Americans on everything, and the Americans give us this, not that we need the charter, but Americans are saying we have the right to defend ourselves, and we understand that. And not only was it not harmful to the relations, I think it accelerated the option of doing things operatively, like Juniper Oak, which was unprecedented. But Professor Chulata, at the time, the Secretary of Defense turned to us in order to, they said, they talked about bunkers, for the exercise that was built in the desert, and with, of course, the bunker, they called them bunker, they were anti-bunker measures. Did the U.S. tell you, though, at the time, that even today, it was the last year, that we, the United States, did they say that we have the ability? The Iranians at the time didn't get into that point for them. The Americans have had their position the entire time. I also saw that, that clip of what you're talking about, and that's the same plane, the same facilities, the same missile, and the same American capabilities. But they're building basically a new platform, basically, that will be able to withstand such an attack. Maybe the Iranians believe they can withstand an American attack. We'll see. I hope not, of course, but, it doesn't matter. The point is that the American policy has always been and consistently been, and Rich is right, that paradoxically, actually in Trump years, there were years in which the Iranians not only thought, but also heard the Americans say, this is not our game. And that's actually quite a paradox. But in any case, I think the Biden administration, among other things, because of maybe, among other things, things that happened in the beginning of his administration, that while he's attempting to come to a nuclear agreement, he also has to do other things. And that's what the Americans did. Maybe not at the pace that Israeli wanted, at the scope Israelis wanted, but they did. So we didn't rely on it. In our preparedness, we didn't rely on the American stance regardless. What we did do, in collaboration with the Americans very successfully, was to make sure that the president is, stays true to his promises to two prime ministers, Bennett and Lapid, apropos the negotiations with the Iranians and going back to the JCPO. And as long we, in our internal dialogue and with them, the Americans, that they recognize where there's potential, that things that occur could maybe exceed these American promises, they went back to their basic stance. And at the end of the day, August 2022, Biden and Lapid have a discussion, and he says to him, even though he wanted very much to do so, he said, we're not going back to the JCPOA. It's midterm, so no JCPOA, practically speaking, and the fact that it happened with a very sort of constructive view from us, support from us, and that we're taking, the blame, I think we also have a significant role to play in shaping how the course of events is planned out. So generally, American and Israeli relations under Lapid, under Bennett, under all of them, and of course, Defense Minister Gantz as well, all of this cockpit among the Israelis is actually a great partnership for the Americans, and I hope that it continues.
An American perspective on that, because I think there is a different side of the coin as well, and that is two things going on. Number one, the Biden administration knew from day one that the president had vowed to go back to the JCPOA or something like it. And they did not want to have a repeat of the Obama administration's breakup with Israel. So how are they going to do that? Rather than have a political feud with the Israelis and have a freezing out of intelligence cooperation and dialogue and strategic planning, there was going to be a bear hug. And so I look at Juniper Oak not as a seriousness of American military might.
Bear hug, meaning bear is a bad animal.
You can use the metaphor however you want it, but a bear hug means we're going to bring you close as possible, arms wrapped around, so we know everything you're thinking, everything you're doing, so that we can be inside your decision planning loop as best we can to prevent something disruptive from happening to our planning. And so Juniper Oak is great messaging, it's great deterrence, but the administration still views all of this as helpful tactics in still maybe getting some sort of diplomatic deal with the Iranians in the end. They're not actually serious, in my view, of using military action themselves. There is a commitment to allow Israel to do what it's going to do, which is perhaps the most important thing. But military deterrence to the United States, joint operations with Israel, these are all tactical moves towards getting back to a deal. JCPOA is off the table, they say. We're not going back to JCPOA because they can't go back to JCPOA. They wasted too much time. The Iranians ran right through JCPOA. So now they have to do a different deal, a worse deal, which would be even more disastrous than JCPOA. So JCPOA might not be on the table, even though, by the way, the sunsets are still on the table. The Security Council resolution is still in effect. We have not snapped back. JCPOA is still alive. But the restrictions, the technical knowledge, the enrichment side, that's in the past.
So you answered,
So you answered one of two questions that I wanted. I have 2 minutes and 4 seconds before I go beyond my time restriction, because I do have all intentions to do that. But I'd like to ask two questions very briefly. I'll address them to all three of you, even though, Mr. Goldberg, you just answered one of them. The first question, do you think that the U.S. will go for a different version or the same version of the JCPOA? There is an argument or debate about that in Israel, despite the promises. Some people say that the U.S. will do that. Number two, what is the red line behind which Israel must decide and attack Iranian nuclear facilities? Major General Norkin, please. Well, first of all, I think that it's not a good idea to draw red lines. And number two, I'll take that last question and use it in order to say that we are examining this threat from the military security strategic angle. To a certain extent, I think that Israel needs to define Iran as an object of a strategic competition on a broad variety of topics. Before we came up to the stage, Amos Gilad talked about the academic part, the economic element aspect, and we need to come up with a plan so that in 5 or 10 years we will still remain ahead in many areas. Of course, that includes the security field, and I think it's the right thing to do to address that. On the security sphere, we're going to keep improving our preparedness. Dr. Hulata, well, first of all, regarding your first question, the President Biden's commitment since the beginning, since early on, was to bring a better agreement than the previous agreement, and his own words, longer, stronger, broader. We said that, you know, in context of what Rich just said about the main illnesses of the previous agreement, that the longer is definitely the most important element, because the sanctions are about to expire and the clock is ticking. In October, this coming October, the sunset of the proliferation of long-range missiles will expire, and in 2 years, a bit more than that, other sunsets of the nuclear is also expiring, and the ability to do snapback in the Security Council. I think he's serious about this, President Biden. I don't know to what extent they'll actually manage to realize that. It's important to say that the previous government's policy was to object to the return to the JCPOA, because that guarantees that there won't be any other way to bring a newer agreement in the future, because once Iran receives everything it's over. As for red lines, you know, red lines, there's a very smart person sitting in this room, and he's told me that the problem with red lines is that then they turn into orange, yellow, pinkish. So it's always best not to speak out loud about these things, but to act when necessary. And I think Norkin's answer about this was very clear. So I see there's not much hope to get a better answer.
You can advise the Israeli government, what's the red line after which Israel should strike?
I also think that red lines are dangerous. I think that there has been a perception for many years that both for the United States and Israel, the enrichment at 90% weapons-grade uranium is a military red line.
They are at 90%, you know.
Well, what I worry about is that we have given that up in some ways, because what happened was the consequence signaled for going to 90% now is the snapback of a UN Security Council resolution.
And General Milley is now talking about
there's no military
deployment, not a warhead. The U.S. government now is talking about deployment.
Well, there's a few things we should remember. I'll leave with these comments. Number one, The idea of sunsets should never have happened. We were obsessed with sunsets in 2015. We talked about the sunsets, longer, stronger sunsets. We just need more sunsets. There is one sunset that matters when Iran has an industrial size enrichment program. It's called a sunset of their choosing. It's a time of their choosing. If they are left with the capability, they will find a time of their choosing. That is one lesson we need to take with us in whatever decisions are coming forward. Number two, I think we also have to understand that the idea of breakout timelines and weaponization are flawed metrics by which to determine action. Breakout is in the past. Breakout was always a flawed dimension because it allowed them to build up capability and just focus on stockpile and deployment of centrifuges. They have IR-6s, they have advanced centrifuges, they have a stockpile. They will be allowed to keep those in storage under any deal that's been talked about. That is no longer part of our metrics. Weaponization, God help you if you have an intelligence failure on weaponization, if that's going to be your metric. That's a big bet for the existence of the State of Israel to be on weaponization. So what do we look at? We have to look at the program's impunity. There is a point at which, and it's hard to define, where you will no longer be able to use your tools to stop the inevitable. And that is your red line.
On this optimistic note, I think we can be rest assured that next year as well, we're going to sit here and discuss this, and this will be the most important and reason for concern. Thank you so much to all of you for coming.